Hey, everybody, and welcome to another deep dive with us. Today we're going to be talking about something that sounds a little bit, maybe boring at first glance, progress.
For
But it's
progress.
going to be anything but boring because we're going to be really kind of challenging the assumptions of what we think of when we hear that word and what it actually means for the world to be getting better.
Yeah, it's so interesting how often we equate progress with just purely material advancements.
Right.
Like faster technology, bigger buildings, just more stuff, you
Yep.
know?
War.
But what if we're missing something?
Yeah, and that's what's so interesting about this deep dive today is that we have these amazing talks from Daniel Schmachtenberger and
Yeah.
Martin Prechtel. And
Yeah.
Daniel kind of dives into these systemic problems with our current progress narrative. And Martin Prechtel is coming at it from a completely different perspective
Totally.
with this indigenous wisdom.
Yeah, and what's so interesting is that they both kind of come to the similar conclusion. Coming from such different backgrounds that a lot of what we consider progress
Yeah.
is actually destructive.
Like a racket.
Yeah.
Dan calls it a racket.
Yeah, like a rigged game
Yeah.
where a few people benefit and a lot of people
At the expense of.
at the expense of most people, yeah.
And you use the example of hydroelectric dams, which are often touted as a
Green.
green solution.
But are they really progress if they're displacing people and disrupting ecosystems?
Yeah, it makes you think about, Martin Prechtel talks about how winners write history.
Yes.
And it's like, who gets to decide
Yeah.
what counts as progress and
Those voices are.
whose voices are silenced in the process?
It's like, have we been so busy looking at the shiny new thing that we haven't really been asking the hard questions
Right.
about who is benefiting from all this and who is paying the price?
Exactly. And it's not even necessarily about pointing fingers or blame. It's more about just recognizing that the definition that we're using has real world consequences.
And, Daniel talks about the rise of diseases that are linked to industrial pollution and processed food,
Right.
which raises a really important question. Are we actually progressing if we're getting sicker?
Right. It's a sobering thought. And then he talks about the Jevons paradox,
Oh, yeah.
which is that we just end up consuming more resources as technology becomes more efficient.
It's like we get more fuel-efficient cars, but then we just drive more.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Have we really progressed if we're just consuming more and creating more waste?
Right, and that's like a classic example of how just focusing on technological solutions
Yeah.
without looking at the underlying pattern.
Its root cause.
Yeah, can lead us down a really dangerous path. And I think this is something that Martin Prechtel would say stems from, our disconnect from the natural world
Right.
and just not understanding the true cost of our actions.
And then it gets really interesting, too, because Daniel talks about how the pursuit of progress in this competitive system actually shapes us psychologically.
Yeah, he talks about hyperagents.
Hyper.
The people who thrive in these kinds of systems, and
Yeah.
he connects them to what psychologists call the dark triad, which is narcissism, Machiavellianism, and sociopathy.
Okay, but before anyone listening thinks we're saying all successful people are bad,
Right.
it's more about recognizing that the system itself might be rewarding these traits
Yeah,
that benefit the individual,
exactly.
but can be detrimental to the collective.
Totally.
So it's like, are these people inherently bad, or is the system making them this way?
Exactly. And this brings us to another fascinating connection between what Daniel is talking about and what Martin is talking about.
Okay.
Because Martin talks about how individualistic cultures struggle with grief.
Oh, wow.
And so we've become so focused on individual achievements and material success that we've lost the ability to collectively process loss and find meaning in it.
It's like we're so busy striving for the next thing that we don't have the space to even grieve for what's already been lost.
Yeah.
The environmental damage, the social injustices.
Yeah, totally. And that inability to grieve and that disconnect from our shared humanity
Yeah.
is really at the root of this unsustainable path that we're on.
Right.
So the question becomes, if this isn't real progress, then what is?
If we're on the wrong track, how do we even begin to course correct?
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah, that is the million-dollar question, isn't it?
right, where do we even begin?
Yeah. And I think both of them offer some really interesting answers.
Okay.
But, they may not be what we want to hear. They might not be those easy solutions that we're kind of used to.
Okay, so we've laid out the problem.
Yeah.
We're chasing progress, but it's actually making things worse.
Yeah.
But where do we even start to find a different path?
I think one thing that both of them point to is this idea of questioning assumptions.
Like,
Like we've taken this idea of technological advancement and economic growth as the definition of progress for so long that we don't even stop to ask, like, progress towards what?
that's such a good point.
What are we actually trying to achieve here?
We're so focused on going faster
Yeah.
that we're not even thinking about, are we going in the right direction?
Exactly. And I think Martin Prechtel would probably say we need to reconnect with a deeper sense of purpose.
Yes.
One that's not tied to material accumulation or individual gain.
Okay. Yeah.
He talks about how indigenous cultures often have this more cyclical understanding of time,
Okay.
where the past and future are like intertwined with the present.
Interesting.
So it's not about this linear progression
Right.
towards some ultimate goal, but it's more about finding this like balance and harmony within the cycles of life.
That's making me rethink how we approach problem solving in our modern world.
Totally.
We're always looking for that quick fix,
Yeah.
the technological solution.
Yeah.
But maybe what we really need is just like a deeper understanding of how everything is interconnected.
Yeah, Daniel talks about that too.
Okay.
From a more like systems thinking perspective.
Right.
He emphasizes this need to look beyond just the immediate problem and think about all the potential unintended consequences of our actions.
Okay.
And he calls it yellow teaming.
Yellow teaming.
Have you ever heard of that?
I don't think so.
Okay, so it's basically kind of like a devil's advocate approach
Okay.
where you try to like poke holes in your own solutions
That makes sense.
before you implement them.
So like when you childproof your home,
Exactly.
like you're not expecting your kid to like get into everything, but you're anticipating
Exactly.
the problems.
Yeah, and I think that's such a crucial skill in a world where everything's so interconnected.
Yeah.
Our actions have such far-reaching consequences.
And this kind of brings us back to what we were talking about with Martin Prechtel and, this idea of grief and responsibility.
Totally.
Because he talks about how in a lot of indigenous cultures, when something bad happens, they don't just look for someone to blame.
Right.
They ask, what did we do to contribute to this?
Yeah. What's our responsibility in this situation?
Like such a different mindset than our culture, where we're always looking for someone to hold accountable.
It's a blame-oriented culture.
Yeah, like instead of just trying to fix the problem,
Yeah.
they're trying to understand their role in creating it and how to prevent it from happening again.
And that brings us to another key insight from Martin Prechtel that really resonates with Daniel's systems thinking approach.
Yeah.
He talks about how colonialism stems from this belief in the separateness of things.
Okay.
So this idea that we're somehow separate from nature, separate from each other, separate from the consequences of our actions.
I'm starting to see how that idea of separation is at the root of so many of the problems we're facing.
Yeah.
It allows us to exploit nature without feeling responsible for the consequences.
Totally.
It allows us to create economic systems that prioritize profit over people and planet.
And it allows us to pursue this idea of progress that's based on extraction and exploitation.
So both Daniel and Martin would probably say that authentic progress requires a pretty fundamental shift in our worldview. Like, we need to recognize our interconnectedness with all things.
Exactly.
But that feels so daunting. How do we even begin to shift our worldview on such a fundamental level?
Well, I think both of them would say that it starts with cultivating awareness.
Okay.
Like really paying attention to the language we use, the stories we tell, the choices we make every day.
Correct.
Martin, for example, talks about how our language, with its emphasis on nouns and categories, reinforces this sense of separation.
Okay.
And he suggests that shifting to a more like verb-centric language, one that focuses on relationships and actions, could help us cultivate a deeper sense of interconnectedness.
So instead of saying like, I am a consumer, you might say, I participate in a system of exchange.
Exactly.
Is that kind of what he's getting at?
Yeah, it's about shifting our focus from these like static categories to the dynamic processes that actually connect us.
Interesting.
And it might seem like a subtle change. But he argues that language has a really profound impact on how we perceive the world and our place in it.
That's pretty mind-blowing.
Yeah.
But is changing our language really going to fix our economic system or stop climate change?
Right.
It seems like we need more than just a vocabulary shift.
You're right. It's not a magic bullet.
Right.
But I think both of them would say that shifting our language is a part of a much larger process of transforming our consciousness.
Okay.
Recognizing that we're not just these isolated individuals striving for personal gain.
Right.
But we're actually a part of this vast interconnected web of life.
Okay.
And when we start to see the world through that lens,
Yeah.
it naturally changes how we think, act, relate to the world around us.
This is all really making me think, but I'm also starting to feel a bit overwhelmed.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, I get that we need to shift our worldview and recognize our interconnectedness.
Yeah.
But how do we actually translate that into like concrete actions? Where do we go from here?
Huh.
So I think that's the question we're all asking. How do we
Mhm.
take these big ideas about interconnectedness and progress
Right.
and turn it into something we can actually do?
Yeah, and I think it's important to remember that this idea of authentic progress
Right.
that both Daniel and Martin are talking about, it's not about reaching like a perfect state.
Right.
It's an ongoing process.
Yeah.
And it starts with realizing that even small choices
Yeah.
can have like a ripple effect.
Okay. I like that it takes the pressure off.
Right.
But what kind of choices are we talking about?
Well, one practice that Martin Prechtel talks about is remembering and honoring the sacrifices that have
Yeah.
been made for our well-being.
Okay.
He talks about how a lot of indigenous cultures start their ceremonies
Yeah.
with expressions of grief and gratitude for the ancestors
So
and the natural world.
Okay.
They recognize that their present moment
Yeah.
is built on those sacrifices
Yeah.
of those who came before them.
That's beautiful. But I'm not sure how that translates into daily life.
Yeah.
Like, I don't have any ancestral ceremonies to participate in.
Right. It doesn't have to be a formal ceremony.
Okay.
It can be as simple as pausing before you eat
Okay.
and expressing gratitude for the farmers who grew your food,
Oh, okay.
the sun and the rain that nourished it,
Right.
people who transported it.
The grocery store workers.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's about shifting our perspective from seeing ourselves as just consumers
Right.
and recognizing that web of interconnectedness
Okay.
that sustains us.
Yeah, that's a really powerful practice. It makes
Mhm.
you realize that even something like eating is part of this huge system,
Right.
and it makes you appreciate those contributions in a whole new way.
And as you cultivate that awareness, you can start to influence your choices.
Yeah.
You might be more likely to support your local farmers,
Right.
reduce your food waste,
Okay.
choose products that are made ethically and sustainably.
So it's not just about making different choices, it's about seeing the world differently.
Exactly. And as you become more aware of these systems, you also start to see those rackets
Right.
that Daniel talks about.
The systems that create the problems in the first place.
Exactly. And you can choose to resist those systems.
Okay.
Support alternatives.
Yeah.
Use your voice to advocate for change.
This makes me think about what you were saying earlier about small actions.
Right.
It's easy to feel like our choices don't matter,
Yeah.
that we're just one person.
Right.
How do we overcome that?
Well, I think Martin Prechtel would say that we're not meant to do this alone.
No.
We're social creatures. We're wired for connection.
Right.
When we come together,
Yeah.
our impact is amplified.
So it's about finding our tribe,
Exactly.
connecting with like-minded people,
Yeah.
working together to create change.
And those communities can look like so many different things.
Right.
A local gardening group,
Okay.
an online forum,
Yeah.
an activist organization.
It's about finding that support system.
Right.
So it's not about fixing everything overnight.
Right.
It's about taking small steps.
Exactly. And gradually shifting towards a better future.
Wow. This has been such a great conversation.
Yeah.
I feel like I'm seeing progress in a totally new light,
That's great.
and I'm ready to start putting these principles into practice.
That's awesome to hear. And just remember,
Yeah.
authentic progress is a journey,
Right.
not a destination.
Right.
It's about constantly learning, adapting,
Okay.
striving to create a more harmonious world.
And as we've learned, it takes questioning our assumptions,
Yes.
embracing our interconnectedness,
Yeah.
and acting with compassion and reverence for life.
Beautifully said. I love that.
So on that note,
Yeah.
we invite all of you listening to join us
Yes.
on this journey of authentic progress.
Let's connect. Let's collaborate.
Yeah.
Let's create a future that's truly worthy of the name.
Thanks for tuning into the Deep Dive.
Yes.
We'll be back next week with another exploration.
See you then.
Until then, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep diving deep.